Okay, we're live. Welcome everyone to this King's Politics live stream session with Professor Judith Butler. For those of you who are not familiar with our guest today, and assume that's not many of you, Judith Butler is Maxine Elliot Professor in the Department of Comparative Literature and the Program of Critical Theory at the University of California, Berkeley. Judith Butler is the author of many important works in gender studies and philosophy, including Gender Trouble, Bodies That Matter, and most recently, The Force of Nonviolence. Thanks to everyone who submitted a question before the session. We really appreciate it. We've got quite a few to get through, but we'll try our best. Charlie is going to be overseeing those, and we've also got a live stream chat on YouTube here. If you have a question, just throw it in there and we'll try and get through them, but we can't guarantee. So Judith, I think a good place to begin is with our immediate situation, the health crisis we're living through, the pandemic. In Frames of War, which is a book from 2009, which is a collection of essays, you're talking about precariousness and precarity as categories of analysis. And during those years, you're thinking in terms of war. It's in the wake of the financial crises. But now, of course, we're living through a pandemic. If you were to apply those categories to the pandemic, what would you say that you've learned? And what have you learned about precariousness and precarity since the pandemic emerged in January 2020?
Yes, okay. A good question, a timely question. Well, I think that in Frames of War and Precarious Life, and then again in The Force of Nonviolence, most recently published by Verso, I have been exploring what I would broadly call interdependency, what many people call interdependency. And by interdependency, I mean not just the personal dependency that we each may have upon some specific set of others, but also a set of global structures that are interdependent, such that food supply chains and environmental processes reveal. And I think we see maybe in the latter two instances that what happens in one part of the world can and does severely affect what happens in another part of the world. This is not the same as an international division of labor. It's more about depending on what people do in different parts of the world in order to live and to thrive where we are. So those people, those laborers, those actors are part of the very conditions on which we rely. We provide conditions on which they rely. We're not always present to one another, but our lives imply one another and depend upon each other, right? So toxic air in one area of the world affects other areas, and even though it might be intensified there, and we can think about toxic soil, we can think about climate change more radically and the destruction of the planet. The pandemic is, of course, devastating, but also interesting. And one way it's interesting is that it shows us that we are linked quite in spite of the ways in which we imagine national boundaries and borders, say, or local territories. The virus travels across them. It has no ID. It doesn't get stopped at any checkpoints. There are no visa requirements. It just travels and it links us, right? The South African variant is here. The Brazilian variant is there. California is linked with Brazil and Africa. I mean, this says something about global exchange, travel, interconnectedness, and we are dependent on each other. And if we act irresponsibly in one zone, that can indeed very profoundly and adversely affect people and life processes in other zones. So I do think we are interdependent, even though I believe that there are fantasies of independence and non-dependency that control the political imagination in many ways. So in Frames of War, I was thinking about how the US licenses itself to bomb and kill other populations in the name of its own security, imagining that it itself would never be the same kind of target that those other countries would be. And here we can think about Iraq or Afghanistan or even Yemen more recently. And of course, one of the scandals for the national imaginary in the United States of 9/11 was that it turned out we were more penetrable than we thought we were. Now, the national ideal could then become, as some militarists argue, to become impenetrable, to make the borders more firm. And we see that now under the pandemic imaginaries, like, oh, there's too much interconnectedness among parts of the world. We must close these borders. We must keep the foreign out, as if the foreign brings us the virus, which imagines that we're not bringing the virus somewhere else. That our right to travel should be secured. Our right to be guarded against those who might want to come here, either bringing their Islam, their religion, their virus, whatever, is absolute. So these kinds of asymmetries, I think, work in nationalist imaginaries and militarist ones, but also certainly during the pandemic. It's probably a longer answer than you wanted. I would just add one thing, which is that we see a massive inequality right now as vaccines are starting to be distributed. Some countries have not seen a single vaccine, and other countries have seen many. Even within my country, there are parts of the country that have seen very few, and other parts where the percentage of those vaccinated is very high, and class and racial differences brought out, and geopolitical inequalities is brought out through the pandemic, and certainly through vaccination demographics as well. So this is a chance both to see the radical inequalities at work and also the aspirational interdependency that would imply radical equality. And that's important to say, because there are forms of interdependency that are exploitative, and there are other forms of interdependency that work in the service of a more radical ideal of equality. And that's a normative distinction that I think we have to keep in mind.
I'd like to ask a little bit about, so building on that kind of idea of borders, but then also precarity, and maybe a slightly more abstract question, but I'd like to ask you about the possibility of a kind of self-referential precarity with regards to identity. So do you think that there's a relationship between the sense of precarity that people seem to feel about immigration, so kind of the crude tagline, they're stealing our jobs, and that TERFs seem to feel about trans inclusionary feminism, so something like they're stealing our feminism kind of thing, because TERFs seem to think that by including trans folk in the feminist movement, something really important is lost.
Yeah. Well, maybe let's shift the language a little bit, or at least I would be inclined to do so. I think we could maybe say that there's an experience of feeling imperiled that happens when dominant groups, or groups that have been able to assume their dominance, their supremacy, their exclusive status, are faced with a challenge and asked not only to include others who have been excluded, but also to live in a world in which all those people, in spite of their differences or because of their differences, deserve equal treatment or equal belonging. So, I mean, I remember in Brazil when I was attacked for espousing what they call gender ideology. The fear was that if there were lesbian and gay parents, if there were transsexual people, that would destroy the family, the nation, civilization as we know it, and man. Man being both man as human and man as masculine, and the intimate connection between those two concepts. And when I probed, like, well, what is that destruction? They mentioned that the mere existence of gay families, lesbian gay families, queer, non-conforming people, trans people, that the very existence destroyed them or imperiled their lives. And the question is, well, are you saying that your lives depend on a secure supremacy, a politics of exclusion, and that anything other than supremacy, exclusion, is a threat to your life? I mean, if so, I mean, you're really saying that your life is bound up with your supremacy and your exclusive status as a family, say, as a heteronormative family, or your understanding of your gender as absolutely linked to heterosexuality. That if there are non-heterosexuals and they are acknowledged, then your gender is somehow attacked and imperiled. And of course, it's not that any of those people, that their gender or their family or their so-called culture, whatever that might be conceived of, is attacked. It's just dislodged from its place as exclusive and hegemonic. And then what you see, I think, or what becomes more clear, is that there's a radical resistance to equality. It's an actually unbearable thought. It's an unacceptable notion. It cannot be that gay and lesbian families are the same as my heterosexual family. It cannot be that a queer gender is the same as my gender, which aligns with normativity of a certain kind, heterosexual, heteronormative. So, what gets called a threat, or what gets called the feeling of being imperiled, is that sense of having an exclusive claim. So let's say there's a class of women and they call themselves feminists, and they say that trans women imperil them. It's not that trans women are attacking them, or maybe they attack them on Twitter or email. Yes, I've seen that for sure. I would prefer not to live in a world in which that was happening, but that's not the same as wielding a knife or attacking someone on the street. And yet there's this blurring, like, I'm attacked, I'm imperiled, and then the question is, well, why would the existence of a trans woman be an attack on a woman who is not trans, who understands herself to have an exclusive monopoly on womanhood? The only thing that's being attacked is her exclusive monopoly. She should, like, just open up the gender, like, welcome people. You want to be a woman? Good. We need more women. Come, join. Why can't there be kind of hospitality, openness, porousness with the notion of gender? Why does it have to be owned? It's like proprietary in this way, possession, exclusive possession. You can't have any. It seems an unnecessary and very lamentable situation.
So I want to turn to a piece in The Guardian that you wrote back in January on Donald Trump. And in that piece, you talk about Trump's indifference to the loss of life. And when he did acknowledge it, it was China's fault. It wasn't the fault of the government in America. I'm interested to hear whether you think that indifference to life is the product of his narcissism or his selfishness, or is it the product of a broader societal and structural indifference to life?
Well, I mean, obviously, there's lots to say on the psychosocial reality of Trump, and that's different from the psychosocial reality of Trumpism. And even that is different from the broader trends in the US and elsewhere toward authoritarianism and the forms of externalized blame that go along with authoritarian regimes that are also stoking nationalist and racist passions. We didn't talk about racism in the last example, but white grievance is exactly that position of like, what are these people of color asking for? White grievance is a loss of supremacy, a loss of an exclusive relationship to the ideals of equality, justice, and freedom, right? It's like, why do these people get to participate in these ideals that were always over here with white people? That, you know, this kind of an enormous sense of grievance, that a sense of supremacy has been lost, right? And that grievance is also involved in the problem of how to undergo that change. Like, yes, you were in charge and you were exclusive, and now you're not. And how are you going to deal with that? You can fight it, you can deny it, you can build your walls, you can engage in racist and hateful speech and action, or you can revise your idea of who you are and the broader community to which you belong. You can open your borders and accept that this is the new world and the new we, and that we have to rethink how we understand race and equality and democratic ideals as available to all. I mean, you know, the refusal to do so is a kind of rancorous and, you know, perhaps melancholic reaction. And by melancholy, I don't mean sad, I mean manic refusal. It's that part of melancholy that is manic refusal of what is manifestly lost. It's like, yes, your supremacy is lost. You can grieve now and then come back and accept radical equality as a necessary norm under which we all must live. And that involves deconstituting your racism at every level in which it is lived and reproduced. I guess I would say that you know, the history of right-wing extremism took a specific form under Trump in the United States, and but we need now to focus less on that character Trump than on the right-wing extremism, the racism, the continuing civil war battle that is not resolved for white people, the continuing emancipation battle that is not resolved for Black people. I mean, that was in the middle of the 19th century, but that war still continues, right? We saw the props and the slogans of the Civil War, the Confederacy, slavery, and which is also linked with very virulent anti-Semitism on the right. So these are ongoing issues, and I guess I would like to see a broader comparative frame, like how do Trump and Bolsonaro fit with Orban, and maybe even neoliberal autocrats like Macron.
Yeah, well,
yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, funny you should say that. I'd like to talk to you a bit about like the university and academia. And so in October 2018, Viktor Orban banned the teaching of gender studies in Hungary. And yeah, do you feel that threats to academic freedom are at a new height today?
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. I just met with a group of Turkish students, philosophy students, who are objecting to Erdogan's appointment of a rector at Boğaziçi University. Now, you might say, you know, what kind of protest is that? Why do we care about a rector? Well, if the rector represents the National Party and has a political mandate to censor views that would be critical of the government, then that is the end of academic freedom, because what university administrators are obligated to do, according to the the principles of academic freedom is to safeguard open inquiry and even the rights to dissent. If within a given country you cannot criticize the government, that means within an academic setting, that means that the universities are now doing the bidding of the government and acting not only to censor open inquiry and political dissent, but to dismantle democracy. So it's a democracy struggle at its heart. And Orban as well. I mean, the students had some great protests against Orban, and they continue to do so. And unfortunately, we're seeing anti-gender legislation in Romania and Poland that threatens the legal status of trans people, the legal status of lesbian and gay people who are adoptive parents, or indeed who have engaged in joint adoption. This is a situation that's happening inside the academy against gender studies, because it's understood as propagating this idea of gender, which denies biological sex and a Christian notion of the heteronormative family, but it's also linked to the general concept of gender as it works in legislation for reproductive rights for women, for anti-rape legislation, for gay and lesbian rights, to be protected against discrimination, to have access to reproductive technology, or to legal parenthood, or indeed trans rights, to establish legally the gender that one is. So, you know, this is as it is in Boğaziçi, what's happening at the level of democracy is also happening in the university. And although academic freedom and freedom of expression, assembly and affiliation are not the same, they are linked, and we see attacks against the two, or by attacking one attacks the other. So we need to have a wide enough lens to understand how that is working now.
And following on the theme of universities, in the UK, Liz Truss, a government minister, has openly attacked Michel Foucault in a speech, and there's this general narrative that postmodernism, whatever that is an assault on truth and liberal values. What do you think of the grievances that some of these government ministers are expressing, and more interestingly, what do you think their political motives are for doing so?
Well, first of all, it would seem to me that someone like Trump has waged a much greater assault on truth than any academic trend. Secondly, I think the idea of postmodernism as a kind of large umbrella term that is somehow exemplified by someone named Foucault is foolish and a kind of reductive figure, a kind of specter, really, if not a phantom of the conservative mind. But I notice that there's a left-wing attack on Foucault, whatever Foucault means, on the part of some Marxists. Not all, but as if Foucault is a danger to the projects of the left. And I find that sad. I don't know, sometimes it is a rank homophobia. Sometimes it is an ill educated stereotype, which Foucault's enormously complex. What you find in the early work is not what you find in the later work on the confessional in the Middle Ages. I mean, is that dangerous? I kind of doubt it. I think that that it's an anti-intellectualism. I guess that would be my third point, that it's a broad anti-intellectualism that opposes the the practice of asking critical questions. Sometimes it's Foucault that's attacked by the right. Sometimes it's something called critical theory, which is also understood as cultural Marxism, and that tends to be a wide range of mainly Jewish thinkers in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, as if the Jews have, waged an intellectual assault on Christian civilization. I think we see kind of base stereotypes being circulated. It's hard to dignify a response. I don't really talk about postmodernism. I don't defend myself as a postmodernist, although I'm called a postmodernist. Usually it's an insult coming from the right or the left, but it's not a term that I use or it's useful to me. I do think when we ask about truth, we have to ask about what are the conditions under which it can appear. It's a Kantian question, really. It's not a postmodern question, it's a Kantian question. Is it the case that there are conditions under which truth appears and can be known? What are those conditions? How can they be secured? Do they have to be secured? And one of those conditions, in public life at least, is a free press, or another one might be open intellectual discourse or open scientific inquiry. We see that even though many scientific enterprises have established the facts of the virus and the facts of the vaccine, that there are fears about the virus, there are conspiracy theories, there are fears about the vaccine, there are paranoid scenarios. So even there, facts have to be established. There has to be a discourse that explains, there has to be science writing, there has to be science reporting. In other words, facts have to be presented to be known. There are conditions under which they appear and can be accepted as such. Now, if you hold to that view, and that is my view, you don't deny facts, but you do say that they are linked to their conditions of appearance. And that was a kind of Kantian presumption in Foucault as well. And I would just worry that sometimes those who say we must hold to facts and dispute postmodernism, whatever that is, are actually imagining that facts speak for themselves, when in fact they have to be presented. We have to persuade people to accept the science of the vaccine. We have to persuade people to accept the science of the virus, and it doesn't mean that those facts are the effect of the presentation or the discourse. Not exactly. But the discourse is the condition of their appearance, and the condition. How would I say this? It's the way in which those facts become intelligible and acceptable to people. So it's never been more urgent to accept that particular proposition. I don't think a return to positivism will help us, because that suggests that that there is no interpretation in the presentation of facts. But if you want facts to be accepted and known, you're going to have to interpret them in certain ways and stage them and even orchestrate them so that they can be seen and known and accepted.
A final question on this kind of broad topic. In an interview with the New Statesman in September 2020, you said we are living in anti-intellectual times. How new and or serious are these anti-intellectual sentiments today compared to the past?
I think that's a great question. Actually, all of these have been excellent questions. Thank you. I don't know. It would be interesting to do a social history of anti-intellectualism to understand how the present day instance compares. I don't know what the geographical and geopolitical parameters of such a study might be, but I do think there's very little patience to understand certain kinds of cultural productions or public utterances. That judgments are quick. They can be very denunciatory. There's very little willingness to ask questions about what somebody meant and let them clarify if they said something and it could possibly sound one way or another. It's a candidate for denunciation, and that's it. I think we've been living in a time in which it's very hard to find the moral coordinates of life. Who stands for what's right and wrong? Who stands for the difference between truth and falsehood? And when leaders are lying openly and shamelessly for their own purposes or the purposes of their party, people take on the function of a kind of superego themselves, right? They're sorting what's real and what's not real in their own lives or on social media. They're producing mini tribunals where justice is administered. And it's because I think of a general loss of faith in governmental authorities and their transparency and accountability, their ability to speak the truth and call out lies. I mean, it's their lies that more often than not are being called out during these times, or at least that has been the recent history here. And I certainly follow what's happening there. I mean, I hope you don't need a PhD in English to understand some of the utterances that Boris makes, but it's a circuitous route, that discourse, right? It starts one place, it ends the other, it confounds itself, it contradicts itself, and then it proclaims itself finished. And I don't know, I maybe he needs an English teacher, I'm not sure. But I do think we have very quick reflex responses, things we hate, things we love, things we ally with, things we disaffiliate with. There's a moral panic about being complicit with the wrong position, or taking some time to consider what is being said and why. And I would like to see greater patience, not the loss of critical capacity, not the loss of moral judgment, but a question: do I have all the facts here? Have I studied this well? Is it possible that this person's statement needs to be put in another kind of context? How does it relate to their prior writing or their other stated claims they've made? Why does judgment come so quickly? I think there's a panic and a fear of a further loss of moral compass, moral orientation. And it's a way in which we all are acting as quick judges in order to reproduce the idea that there might be at least local versions of justice somewhere.
So let's move on to Gender Trouble, which is the book you're probably most well known for. I think it's 31 years since it was first published. I'm sure you wrote it a few years before that. Has your thinking on gender basically remained the same since you wrote the book, or have you changed your thoughts?
I'm quite sure I've changed my thoughts in many ways. I'm not sure I would be able to elaborate them. Maybe I can make 3 quick points. I think 30 years ago, I didn't sufficiently distinguish between the idea of gender that is performed, that is to say, simply brought into being out of nothing, and the idea of gender as a reworking of existing norms that have affected us and formed us from the beginning. So some people see it as a text that espouses a voluntarism, and others see it as a way to think about subversion and struggle within a highly culturally constructed and restricted situation. I think I'm responsible for both readings. I think I wasn't always consistent and maybe erred on the side of exaggeration because I didn't really imagine anyone would read the book. And I suppose secondly, I would say that it was not a book in which I directly addressed trans issues, although I briefly addressed the issue of drag. I don't think drag is the same as trans. And I think I was trying to move towards an idea of what we would now call a non-binary position. And I've even taken that on in for my aging self. But I think that there was some pushback from trans people who said, look, my gender is not performative. It's not performed. This is actually my reality. And your position doesn't allow me to have my reality. I think what I would have done is tried to understand the more deep-seated sense of gender identity, and to give that a kind of dignity that it clearly deserves. But I would also have explained better that to perform a gender is also to change the terms of social reality. It's not fakery. It's not artificial. It's not opposed to what is real. It is, in fact, a way of changing the terms of social reality. So when somebody lay claims to a trans identity before a court of law, that action is, for me, a performative action. It's to say, this is what I am. I bring it into discourse, and I insist that it become a social reality for everybody. That would be how I would read performativity. Now, I also think that there are ways of thinking gender and race and class, region, histories of colonization that have made gender studies much more rich and complicated and responsive to existing social realities that I didn't do then. I've done some since, but I think that's probably a weakness of that book.
So I think following on from that, then I'd like to ask you a little bit about how your performative theory of gender relates to the non-binary experience. So in the second edition of Gender Trouble, you say that the term woman should be understood as a term in process, a becoming, constructing. It cannot rightfully be said to originate or end, and it's open to intervention and resignification. And that's why gender is something that's done through repetition. But I acknowledge, obviously, that that kind of repetition isn't like a choice that we make when we wake up. We're not saying, today I'm going to put on these clothes and be a woman kind of thing, because as you stressed in Bodies That Matter. But yeah, I was just wondering, how does this becoming and constructing apply to the non-binary experience? Is it kind of the repetition of a set of behaviors and actions that don't conform, or is it about stopping that repetition in its tracks, or is that just way off from how you think of it?
Yes. Well, first of all, we talked earlier about the historical capacity of the category of women to change, right? Like it has meant many things in the history of English, and it's meant very many different things in the history of other languages. So there's also in the background like a very big issue of translation. Gender theory can't really function without translation, because otherwise we assume that the way gender functions in English is the way it functions everywhere, and that's, of course, an imperialist assumption. And indeed, the grammar and the syntax of gender in many languages suggests that it's a much more relational concept. Sometimes gender inflects a verb. It's not an independent kind of noun. This is my gender, my adjective. This is some ontological part of me. So there are many different ways of approaching this question. But of course, feminism has always relied on the idea of the category of woman as an historical category. And we see this in the work of Joan Scott, or Denise Riley, or Bell Hooks, or many other people. And that means that what it means to be a woman, what a woman wants, what gets included in the category changes through time. Can one do this activity and still be a woman? Well, no, in one period of time, and yes, in another. And we need that changeability. So to invite trans, or to accept trans women as women, for those of us who are not trans, is to accept the historical openness of the category. So that's one point that I think is extremely important here. And I guess I would just add to that that for non-binary people, I mean, there are different versions of the non-binary. It's not a nothing. It's not an absence of one or the other. I think about the old and vicious attacks on bisexuals, like, oh, you just can't decide, or, oh, you're a liar. You're always fooling people. You're always deceptive in your sexual relations. Like, why? Why would that be true of bisexual people? Why can't they just have complex relationships with men and women, and that's part of their life experience? It's not a contradiction, and it's not an absence of identity. It's just a complexity that might be better described through a narrative reconstruction than a set of identity categories. And similarly, I think non-binary, as in terms of gender, I mean, it's no, not quite, and no, not quite. Are you a mother? No, I'm a parent. Are you a father then? Well, kind of, but maybe not. So an inadequacy of the existing gender language to fully describe or locate the person, which doesn't mean that they are nowhere, but that they are developing another set of vocabularies to describe a particular kind of complexity that's not easily grasped by existing gender norms. And I think that's true of gender queer people. And of course, we have many vocabularies in English and in other languages for trying to describe that spectrum. But non-binary is a way of saying, of course, impinged upon by this gender and impinged upon by that gender, and sometimes occupying, but not ever quite being fully identified. And it's that gap that gets honored or marked or acknowledged. A refusal to be captured by existing historical categories, maybe even a form of waiting for new language that feels better, where a sense of belonging can be more firmly registered.
And I'd like to talk to you a bit about pornography, because, yeah, you were studying for your PhD, I think, in the 80s when Dworkin and McKinnon were kind of getting their off the ground. And just a bit of context for people watching, McKinnon is a legal scholar and Dworkin was a radical feminist and writer, and together they devised a set of ordinances which set out to make the legal definition of pornography a form of subordination, and to give women the right to seek damages under a civil rights law rather than the pre-existing obscenity law. And so, yeah, they're central figures in the anti-pornography feminist movement. And I guess I was just wondering, what was it like to be in the States studying for PhD when pornography was being so hotly debated? Was there a sense of that? Did you have a particular view of pornography then that maybe has changed now? Sorry, that's 3 questions, but.
Well, it was very exciting and very complicated. I tended not to ally with Dworkin and McKinnon, although I have great respect for McKinnon's legal work and her early work on sexual harassment. I think is really excellent. It was groundbreaking and allowed for universities to adopt policies that are enormously important. And Dworkin I liked as a writer. I mean, I thought she was powerful. But I was struck by the fact that every time she described a pornographic scene that was supposed to be awful, half the audience thought it was pretty great. And and these were feminists, who were like, oh, we have a divided community here. I think one question is, well, what happens at the level of the image? Like, certain things can happen at the level of the image. We go to films and watch murders, and we see violent crimes on television, and I'm not sure they lead us to go out and commit those crimes. There may be some pathological conditions in which that happens, but maybe those pathological conditions pre-existed the exposure to the violent scene. So I want to suggest that we need to keep like dream and fantasy and image slightly separate from, not fully, but slightly separate from action and practice. Somebody can appreciate something in a film or a video that they would not actually do, and they do because it either it affects us, or it exposes something about human passions, even in their extremes, that we need to see and understand. It doesn't mean that we will therefore act in the exact same way that someone on the screen is acting. If we did, then, well, we would be acting according to a pretty behaviorist model. Like, if I see this, I will do this. That makes us very stupid. It makes us into creatures who don't reflect on the difference between what we see and how we act. I mean, even people who watch Shakespeare would be, I don't know, like, oh, you saw, you saw Lady Macbeth kill someone, and now you're going to go do. No, we don't say that. I mean, of course, it's generally speaking much better art than most pornography, but maybe not all. The second point is that, pornography has a long history, and James Joyce was accused of pornography, and the feminist health manual, Our Bodies, Ourselves, was accused of pornography. The right wing accuses lesbian fiction of pornography. This is an historical category that gets used in this way or that. So if we install certain laws against pornography, what are we risking? We're risking that they could be used precisely against those of us who want a more who want the possibility of representations of trans sex, or interracial sexuality, or any number of things that are frowned upon or hated and attacked by right-wing people. So I'm very worried about putting that into the law. And luckily, it didn't really work very well, precisely because of some of these questions. If a child is exploited in child pornography, I mean, I think that's criminal and should be shut down. I'm absolutely opposed. If a woman or a young person or a man is exploited, made to do something against their will, or not paid a decent wage, I mean, I would oppose that absolutely. Which is why I would be in favor of the unionization of people who are working in sex video industries. I'm more worried. I have the same worry about sex workers. I want them to have health insurance and pensions and safety on the job. So, I don't celebrate pornography, but I am somewhat worried about the attacks on pornography. I'm not sure my views have changed that much. I've become wiser about the industry and the exploitation and violence within the industry, and I'm opposed to that. But I don't think that means that we have to condemn all pornography if we know how to define it. Nor do I think that we can use pornography as the model of what masculine domination is, which is what Dworkin and McKinnon were doing. They were saying, look, we can look at pornography and have there a miniature version, an index for masculine domination in the world, masculine sexual domination. That's what it is. It's like, it doesn't always do that. Sometimes sometimes it actually deconstitutes masculine domination, and sometimes it's made by women and it's doing something very different. And the efforts to distinguish erotica from pornography seem to me to falter because no one ever agreed. And no one ever will agree because human sexuality is so diverse. My view.
So I'll be coming in now with some questions that we have from the audience and the wider student body. The first of these is on, we've covered a little bit of this, but why do you think a lot of high-profile, older, self-proclaimed feminists in the UK so recently investing so much energy into anti-trans rhetoric? And what specific actions do you think will combat TERFs trying to sever the links within intersectionality?
Well, I think there are, I mean, perhaps we could say that there are feminists who believe that feminism must be an autonomous social movement without links to labor, to the left, to groups fighting climate destruction, to anti-racist struggles, to trans struggles, to the struggle against Islamophobia, that they don't see feminism as an alliance or as part of a interconnected set of social movements. And I think when you, or that question rather, refers to intersectionality, they are perhaps referring to that alliance structure, that sense that these are complex vectors of power that are interlinking and very often working in tandem or supporting one another in certain ways. And I think there's a fear, that, feminists were always subordinated on the left to men, and they were, feminism was a secondary oppression, the oppression of women was a secondary or tertiary oppression, and that it was necessary to have an autonomous feminism because otherwise you would be, the force of what you're doing is diluted or you are appropriated. I don't really know what's happening in the UK. It's true, it is unlike what I discover in other countries. I will say that. What I'm worried about is that during the time in which these right-wing governments we see, as I mentioned, in Hungary and Poland and Romania, but also under the Trump regime, the attacks on trans existence, that these feminists would rather ally with them. They can't not be in alliance. In other words, you can try to be independent, like I'm not in alliance, this is my feminist position. You lie. You're lying. You're resonating with a very right-wing attack on trans people, which is also an attack on women's reproductive freedom and their right to abortion. It's also an attack on lesbian and gay rights, on rights of parenting, of rights of adoption. This is these are linked. These are interlinking struggles, and let's remember, there is no category of woman that is apart from a dynamic of race. Every woman is racially marked or is racialized differentially, and this is complex. We can't live in a world in which gender is over here and class and race over here. They are interlinking very, very deeply, and I would add disability as an extraordinarily important issue here as well. And religion and formation under colonial regimes or in post-colonial predicaments. All these are really important to take into account, and the best work in feminism is within those broader frameworks now. It's one of the laments I have about gender trouble as a text from 30 years ago. So I do think that there is a biological essentialism that has come back into vogue politically among some feminists who believe that their sex is being appropriated by those who have no right to it. And that I think does come from a long and deep history of the instrumentalization of women's reproductive capacities, the denial of the right to abortion because men or husbands or fathers own that reproductive organ. But I think we make a mistake when we use the language of ownership. The idea of expropriation also comes out of ownership. This is my property. You are taking my property away. It's a shared property. It's a shared property. It's a variable and complex terrain, what we call our sex. And how it's defined, the terms in which it's defined, how it's valued, differs very, very widely, which is one reason why it's not always possible to delink sex from gender. When we start talking about sex, we're already giving it social meanings. It's not a pure biological reality. And biological essentialism, you know, it usually is accompanied by the view that those with certain biological features also have certain moral attitudes or certain ethical dispositions. And it just is not true. It is just not true. And many people who are born with certain biological features and are called a gender by virtue of those features have to struggle with the fact that the lived reality of that body is a very different phenomenon. And what a lot of the anti-trans feminists fail to understand is that many people who are born as or called female at birth by medical authorities, right? That's an interpolation. They are not female. They are called female and they become female in law and in medicine. And that's an institutionalization of their sex that many also feel like this is not right. This is not me. This is not the name. This is not the category. And that dissonance, it can be, you know, a gentler form of disidentification, like I don't really feel good about this, or it can be an absolute. This is an absolute insufferability, intolerability, which does hopefully lead to gender transition, so that life can become more livable. But if we're feminists, we want life to be more livable for more people on this earth, right? That's what we affirm, which is, so there's just no reason why feminism and trans rights shouldn't be linked in a deep solidarity. In fact, it's a kind of litmus test these days. You know, what's the feminism we want to embrace? Well, it's the one that's anti-racist. It's the one that's anti-capitalist. It's the one that is linked to trying to save the earth from destruction, and that is embracing trans life and trans claims. I mean, it's got to be a big, broad tent if we're going to move anything forward in this world.
That was really insightful. Thank you. I've got another one here. This one looking at academia more generally. It follows there have been real efforts over the past several years from students and staff aimed at radically changing the university, for example, in divesting from fossil fuels, decolonizing the curriculum, or ensuring fairer pay for staff. So what potential do you think these alliances have in rebuilding the university now, especially after the pandemic?
Well, it's a big struggle. I'm not sure what this question has described is one struggle. I think they're different strands, or maybe even different struggles. So I think what's really crucial is the effort to provide decent working conditions for staff, what we call faculty, but all staff really, including administrators and administrative assistants, and affordable education so that students are not faced with unpayable debts and are not exploited through a kind of debt servitude. I also think that it's a moment in which the curriculum does have to be revised. Doesn't mean we have to throw out Shakespeare in order to decolonize the curriculum. There are many fabulous versions of Shakespeare throughout the world. Maybe we have to globalize our Shakespeare, right? Or globalize our Plato to see how it works at different places and in different ways, so that we're not using universities to valorize one cultural tradition at the expense of all cultural traditions. It's interesting for me to follow the debates in South Africa about the remaking of the university and to see how very hard it is. Apartheid came to an end, and yet many of the curriculum, even in predominantly Black universities, continued with an apartheid curriculum. So it was the same canon. the struggle to get Black studies on the books at South African universities has not been easy. Is that an import from the North, from the West, or is that something that actually many Black South African scholars have been working on, and indeed in some extremely interesting ways? So these are ongoing struggles. A lot of them are local, though, right? So I see, for instance, decolonizing the universities as a movement that has a certain variation in Latin America, and it takes a different version in the UK and the US. Sometimes they're linked, sometimes they're not. I find it very interesting. I think I follow Françoise Vergès, who says that the decolonial is not a thing, it's a process, and it's an open-ended one. It's an ongoing process, right? It's not as if we will complete the task and then we will arrive with the decolonial university. It will be a continuing one. But opening up the curriculum and making universities more responsive to a wide range of cultural and social histories, understanding the implication of first world powers in colonialism and racism and slavery. These are crucial ways these are crucial histories to know and to teach. And we can't set them aside as extraneous to what the university is about.
Thank you. I've got just one last question from the wider student body, and this one is about queer spaces, the future of queer spaces. In light of the pandemic, the typical LGBTQ plus spaces, bars, clubs have all been shut down. And historically, these have been really central spaces for togetherness, solidarity, and joy. How do you think queer spaces will look post-pandemic?
It's a good question, and I don't know the answer. I think what we might have during the pandemic are queer affiliations and queer kinship networks that are working as mutual aid societies or as extended kinship networks that take the place of traditional family forms, or that build upon a traditional family form and expand it. Maybe it's a moment to rethink queer kinship and how that works. The digital world is also a queer space and has always been, and we've all become perhaps more digital than we want it to be. It can be exciting, it can be intimate, it can be deeply disembodying and leave us lonely. I think that probably also we can imagine queer spaces as exemplifying principles of care that are not just linked to the domestic scene, that are about being there for one another without necessarily being married or being connected by so-called bloodlines, if they exist. So I think that happens. It happens virtually. It happens through periodic visits or the walk or the stray congregating in parks. And that care, if we build that up as a practice, it will enter into our queer spaces. It will allow us to think, how do we make a queer space porous so that people can come and go as they need, so that they have alternatives to the household, especially young queers who find it suffocating, if not perilous to their lives, to be trapped in the family of origin domicile. I surely could not have survived as a queer kid if I couldn't have hopped on my bicycle and gone to several other places where there was some queer congregating. So we're going to need to figure out what that looks like and how that looks. But I'm also very aware, that public health has become a rubric under which governments can now make emergency decisions. And in homophobic and transphobic places or in anti-feminist places, the they can attack trans people on the street or arrest them, out of considerations of public health. I saw that happened in Panama. I see that happens also in places like Romania. So we need to be very mindful of that and oppose those efforts. It's an overreach of the public health mandate and the emergency powers associated with it. And it can be used to really disperse us and deny us our basic rights of assembly and affiliation.
I think that's all we've got time for, Judith. We'd love to chat for hours, but we appreciate that you've got things to do as well. We really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming to talk with us today.
Thank you. These were wonderful questions, and I'm only sorry we can't be there in person together.
Yes, exactly. And we appreciate that it's particularly early for you as well.
No, it's all good.
Yeah. All right. So thanks for joining us, and I speak on behalf of everyone from Cambridge and indeed across the world for tuning in.
Great. Thank you.